We're very glad to have you here tonight as we present to you an honest inquiry into origins. My name is Kirk Hoffler. I'm the president for the Society for Creation Science here at UT. This organization is a campus organization which has been formed here and on a number of other college campuses throughout the nation in order to provide or to present to the academic community evidence which supports a recent creation origin. Tonight we're going to be turning our attention to evidence which is much closer to home, dealing directly with the origin of the earth. Now I'd like to say first off that I'm sure a lot of you are here from the natural sciences, and we welcome you. We're not here to deplore or to make fun of anyone, and we'd like you to know that you're welcome. We also very much welcome the faculty, who I'm sure has sacrificed time in order to come and be present for this presentation. A few things I'd like to mention before we begin is, one, the book taking a historical approach of this subject by Dr. Gentry is on sale at the tables on the far side over here, and you'll be more than welcome, if you'd like to go over and take a look or purchase one, to do so after the presentation. Our guest speaker tonight comes to us having conducted 13 years of research at Oak Ridge National Laboratory as a guest scientist. He has published over 20 articles in leading scientific journals, both here and abroad, that is, here in America and abroad, concerning his research. And I hope you'll find this to be an enjoyable and a challenging evening. I'd like to ask you to please welcome Dr. Robert Gentry.
Thank you. Happy to be with you this evening. Over 30 years ago, I was a freshman at the University of Florida, taking the freshman biology course. I ran into a topic called evolution. Previous to that time, I have to admit, I believed the conservative biblical account of creation. That is the Genesis account, for in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. But as I was confronted with evolution there at the University of Florida in my biology class, heard the persuasive arguments in favor of evolution, I began to think, could it possibly be that, science is really so much different than what I've grown up with? Well, I didn't become an evolutionist as a result of the biology course by itself, but as I continued to take physics courses at the University of Florida, I ran into courses in nuclear physics, and there I found that, of course, we could use techniques called radioactive dating to date the Earth. And from there to graduate school, taking courses in cosmology, and there I thought I learned the most beautiful theory I'd ever seen, the cosmological development of the universe from something called the Big Bang. Now, I'm sure just about everyone in the auditorium knows about the Big Bang. That's the most popular scientific explanation of how we got here tonight. Let's review it just briefly. Supposedly, 17 billion years ago, there was a gigantic explosion someplace in the universe. Now, I say explosion, that really isn't exactly correct because nothing existed before that time, presumably. But from some point in space where nothing existed before, matter came out. And as the matter came out, it was very hot. Particles developed, and a giant fireball formed, which began to expand and expand and expand for hundreds of thousands of years. And then a change took place in the temperature of the fireball so that it became less opaque. Well, to make a long story very, very short, from that giant primeval fireball developed, supposedly, stars. Now, it wasn't easy for me in that relativity course to understand how stars could form as a result of an explosion. because obviously if we have an explosion today, we don't see things coming back together again or accumulating. That wasn't easy for me to understand. It wasn't easy for me to understand how stars could collect into galaxies. In fact, the beautiful spiral galaxies, which are all over the universe. How did the order come about from something that was so random in its origin? So questions began to arise in my mind. But the greatest question of all concerned the beginning itself. How was it? As a physicist, I was taught in my undergraduate days that matter can either be created or destroyed, and I'd accepted that. How is it that something came out of nothing at the Big Bang? Well, I pondered the question week after week, and one day in class, I guess I was whispering to some of my classmates just what's going on. And the professor, who was very cordial, probably realized what I was doing. In fact, he sensed a semi-rebellion in the class because of this, what I felt was a contradiction, and maybe I'd influenced other people. Anyway, he stopped the class one day in the technical presentation, and he said, I suppose that you're wondering about this situation of the Big Bang. How did it all begin? In fact, I'd raised some questions about it. He said, well, earlier, back in the 1930s, late 1920s, there was a Belgian scientist, a priest, a Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. And Lemaitre had the idea that the Big Bang actually began by the finger of God. And that's what started it all. And I thought, well, what a wonderful explanation. Here we can combine science and the entrance of God into the universe. And so from then on, no matter what was said in the cosmology course, I personally was able to put God into the picture, and before the course was over, I had become fully and completely atheistic evolutionist. I believed in the Big Bang, the development of the universe. Now, at that time, it wasn't 17 billion years ago. In fact, the final examination for the course was to calculate the time of the Big Bang from some of the cosmological parameters that were presumably known at that time or presumably guessed at that time. And I did. In fact, I still have the final examination from that course. I did well on it according to the professor. I calculated something like 5.2 billion years for the origin of the Big Bang. He was happy and I was happy. And I left the University of Florida with a master's degree in physics, thinking that I had solved, or at least of my own thinking, I'd put together a God of science and a God of truth. I retained a belief in the Bible, at least somewhat, believing that now the 6 days of creation were no longer literal days, but were vast geological periods of time. In other words, I'd become like most people are today in terms of how they consider their origin. I'd become a believer in biological evolution as well. And when I went to work in the defense industry at that time, I remember people would argue. Some people would argue about evolution. And I was vehement. I defended evolution at every turn for years. Later down the road, a few years later, someone confronted me with another part of the Bible. It's part of the Ten Commandments. And it has in it the creation story written all over again. If you want to read it sometime, it's in Exodus, the 20th chapter, and around verse number 11. It's part of the Ten Commandments. You see, up until this time, I had been able to marry a God of truth with a God of science by this way of believing in the Big Bang and believing that Genesis was some sort of story that was not really meant to be true. But now it seemed to me there was something more here. I was dealing with a moral issue. And it began to bother me considerably. It bothered me for years. And as a result of that, I decided I had to go back and start to do some investigating for myself. And investigating myself, I wanted to go back to the grassroots, so to speak, of why I believe what I believe. Why did I accept what I did about the Big Bang, about the age of the earth, about biological evolution, and so forth? So I got some books, or at least I tried to find books, and there were very few and far between. This is now 25, 26, 27, 28 years ago. And I couldn't find very much. Everything seemed to confirm what I had been taught at the University of Florida. But one day I came across a book, And some of you here may know it. It's written by some people who are today creation scientists, and they were then creation scientists. It's called The Genesis Flood. Well, I was curious about everything, so I read the book, and in the part of the book, in the last part of the book, they mention a phenomenon called plerochoric or radioactive halos. These were mentioned because it was this phenomena in the basement granite rocks of the world that supposedly determined whether or not one could actually ascertain dates or ages using radioactive dating. And as a physicist, of course, this was my main support for evolution. I believe that indeed one could, by radioactive dating, date the Earth to be several billion years old, and the fossils within the rocks were hundreds of millions of years old. But I began to realize that if one has a rock sample, such as this granite I'm holding in my hand, which presumably, on the uniformitarian basis, is several billion years old. Well, what happens if one tries to date this, or the process that one goes about in dating it? You take the rock in the laboratory, you crush it, and then you do some chemistry on it, and you extract elements like uranium, which is radioactive. Then you extract the daughter end product, which is lead, and you measure one and the other. And if the transformation rate of uranium, which is radioactive, is a constant over a period of time, over the time presumably the Earth has been here, then you can calculate the age of the rock. Now, the rock, of course, doesn't have any age stamped on it. We all know that. But I realized more fully than ever that everything really hinged on whether indeed that assumption, that constant decay rate assumption, was valid. And these tiny little halos that I had just found out about were supposedly the key that told scientists years and years ago that the radioactive decay process had been constant over what we call geological time. And as a result of that, I knew that this is where I wanted to begin to look again. Was the basic premise really true? Well, at this particular time, I had transferred operations from the University of Florida. Pardon me, I went to the defense industry, and then I got out of the defense industry and taught for a while, and then I went to a small college and taught for a while. Then I went to Georgia Tech. I began working on my PhD in physics in 1962. It was about this time my interest in the age of the Earth really began to focus. In fact, I was there to get my PhD and teaching at the same time. Well, I no sooner got on campus than I wanted to, of course, think about a thesis topic, and I'd become very interested in this topic of radioactive halos. I'd been doing some reading and studying for a few months. So in the fall of '62, I began to think very seriously about this as a thesis topic, and I went to see the department chairman to find out how he might feel. Well, I was a little bit surprised. First of all, he indicated to me that he himself had been a believer, or a creationist, so to speak, years ago. He had accepted evolution, and he sort of warned me off the ground that I was about to tread on, saying that he didn't feel like, first of all, it was going to amount to anything for me to do any research in this area. And in every cordial way and kind way that he could, he tried to dissuade me over the next few months from actually wanting to do the topic, wanting to do thesis in this area. But as things have it, of course, I became more and more interested, and as a result of that, felt I had to look into this area simply to satisfy myself. I couldn't go on with a great deal of uncertainty in my life as I had at that particular time. So I told him this, and I stayed there for 2 years, but still conversing with him back and forth, and he finally got around to telling me that if I really felt that strongly about it, that I should not plan to stay and get my PhD at Georgia Tech, that indeed if I wanted to stay, it was going to have to be with another thesis topic. And he said, and whatever might happen, he said, what would happen to Georgia Tech, by the way, if you did find something that would call the conventional scientific view of Earth history into question? He said, you could be an embarrassment to this institution. And I said, well, I never thought of it like that, but I suppose that was a possibility. In any event, it became very clear that he did not want me to stay and to do that research. I wanted to do it, and so I voluntarily left. So in the summer now, this is 1964, I infringed upon my wife's very good nature and began to do research on nothing. meaning no financial resources. I had borrowed a microscope, and I had some mineral samples that had halos in them. In fact, I took a trip to Dalhousie University, where this kind of research was done many, many years ago, in the 1930s. Loaned borrowed money, for that matter, and began to use the borrowed microscope to look very carefully in the samples of rock that I had to try to find these special halos, meaning now special in this case, meaning simply the ordinary uranium halos, the halos that supposedly would tell me whether or not this decay rate had always been constant. So I put everything I had into trying to find the answer as I began this journey, which you're going to hear more about this evening. What did I find as I looked into these rocks? Well, the kind of rock that I used mostly was what we call biotite, a crystal of mica. And the reason I use this type of mineral mostly is because it's very easily cleaved. You can make a thin section, a very thin section of the rock itself by simply putting a piece of Scotch tape on it, peeling it back, putting it on a glass slide, putting it under the microscope, and begin to search for these little tiny radioactive halos. This time we'll go now to the 35 millimeter projector and we'll discuss, and I'll show you what I found over the years that I've been working. What you see, of course, is a little crystal of biotite inside the penny, which I've just shown you. This is the kind of mineral that I was working with. What you're seeing now is a uranium halo. What has happened is, if you look at the very tiny dot in the center of that series of rings, what you're looking at here is something that developed as a result of radioactive particles being emanated or shot out from the center, that little tiny center in the front, or in the middle of the halo itself. You see, I think, 5 separate rings. Now, that halo developed as a result of uranium-238 decaying sequentially, all the way down from uranium-238 to uranium-234 to thorium-230 to radium-226 to radon-222, and then it goes through a series of polonium isotopes, ends up in lead. It's two-dimensional as you're looking at it on the screen tonight, but in the rock it's three-dimensional. What I've done is to slice a section right through the center of the halo itself. Now, the reason scientists, geologists, physicists were interested in these halos is because the ring structure, the size of those rings, they thought gave information as to whether or not the uranium decay chain or uranium itself had decayed at the same rate that it's decaying now. And that's the reason for that. The importance of that is that everything concerning, of course, the history of our Earth depends upon accepting the basic premise of uniformity, or what we call the overall principle of uniformitarian principle. Well, in looking at this particular sample, you might want to try to jiggle the connection down there. That might help a little bit. Otherwise, we'll just continue with letting you push the slides one by one. Here we have at least a schematic indicating to you what is happening in the mineral. As light interacts with photographic film to give you a picture, so tiny particles emitted from a very tiny center will discolor the mineral, at least if you have the right kind of mineral. It's a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction produces a coloration in the mineral itself, just like light interacting on photographic film. And you can see the little arrows extending from the center. Those arrows denote the distance through which some of these particles will emanate or travel before they come to rest in the mineral. Now, you see, we've sliced it in such a way to make it appear that it's three-dimensional. In other words, you really have a sphere, and this is exactly the way it appears in the mineral itself. Most of you perhaps will not understand all that's involved in this particular diagram. What I'm showing here is the so-called uranium decay chain. It starts with uranium-238. If you look at the arrow going to the upper right, you'll see a little symbol, the Greek symbol alpha. That means that uranium-238, the nucleus emits an alpha particle, a rather heavy particle, and it decays to what is known as thorium-234. Then you see the arrow going down to the lower right. It's a beta particle. That particle is very light. It's an electron. It doesn't produce any coloration. So every time you look and see an alpha particle in that chain up there, you see a particle that conceivably can produce coloration or a ring. In other words, if you have, for example, a cannon, and you put a shell in the cannon of a certain specified powder load, the shell is going to travel the same distance each time, provided you have the same powder load and you're firing it through the same medium. Well, here is a cutaway or a schematic. If, again, the radioactivity is there in the center, then all these different parts of the uranium decay chain, all the different daughter products there, will give you rings or shells, colored shells, which develop around that little tiny center. You have to have now just not one or two, but you have to have about 100 million particles that will be produced in order for this coloration to develop. So I can easily relate the uranium decay chain with this sort of schematic that you're seeing right here. And here's another uranium halo and another piece of mica. Again, now this was from the Black Hills. Earlier we were looking at something that came from a rock in Canada. And we can go to the other side of our world, go over to Germany, and there we can pick up minerals, pieces of mineral called fluorite from Bavaria, and we can section those minerals and look at them again, and there we see halos in a mineral called fluorite. And now we're going to see a little bit of the beauty that you see under the microscope as you study the phenomenon. We'll go rapidly through this series of slides. These are all uranium halos. They are of a different coloration. Some of them, like the one you're seeing right here, has an inner bleached area, and the reason is because it's what we call overexposed. Now over to the right there you can see a halo with two rings. Actually there's a third ring which you can hardly see. We're going to be talking about that in just a little bit more in a few minutes. But there are many different kinds of these unusual shapes and sizes under them you can see under the microscope. Many of them can be related, in fact most of them can be related in this particular instance to what is happening just to uranium, something very, very common. Here's another overexposed uranium halo again in this fluorite. There's another overexposed uranium halo. There's another overexposed uranium halo. And now we go to a different part of the world. And I'm just showing you this to help you see a little variety of things that we worked with over the years. My invitation to come, as I'll be telling you a little while later, to come here to Tennessee did not result because of the work I'm doing relative to creation, but to something else. In this particular sample, in this particular halo, in this case, the inclusion or the center is quite large compared to the actual coloration itself. You can see the resemblance, of course, to the football field. That's an inclusion or a radio center there. And the yellowish coloration around that was produced by radioactivity in that yellow center. This particular sample and this one came from Madagascar. In fact, this particular halo right here that you're seeing is larger than anything that we can associate with any known type of radioactivity. And there's a real story behind all of that that is told in the pages of my book. I don't have time tonight, but just barely skim the surface of this one. So we'll go to the next one. Again, an unusual type of radioactive halo, which is thus far, I'll simply say I'm still working on the research on this one. These are the so-called dwarf halos that are found in the micas, the biotites, from Ytterby in Sweden. And again, their origin is presently unknown. But now we turn to something that we can identify, the single disc-like halo you're seeing here. And in the next slide, something a little bit simpler. You can see the two discs are the same here and in the last slide. And here's one of these same circular disc-like halos here in the fluorite. Now the sizes are a little bit different because what I've done, of course, is to take the photographs at different times under different magnifications. But the basic circular outline you see here, we're going to find out what it's due to in just a minute. Well, it turns out that the radius of this halo can be associated with an isotope of the element polonium. Now, the interesting thing here is the polonium that we're talking about here has a half-life that is relatively short compared to the supposed history of the Earth. The 138 days is what we have listed there. The next slide. And one of the most amazing types of the radioactive halos I've ever found, if you can believe it, this is a type of the polonium-210 halos in which you have an innumerable number of them all side by side. In other words, it's composed of maybe 50 or 100 or 200 of the polonium halos side by side in the pattern of a pair of spectacles. And so this was perhaps one of the most unusual ones I'd ever found, and I took pains to analyzed it very carefully with some of the people I was working with at that particular time. And what we found, and I won't go into all the details tonight, but it's a part of the report which is reprinted in the book. What I found is simply that the little tiny centers there of this so-called spectacle halo all result from the decay of this polonium-210. In other words, we have a halo that is geometrically unusual and also unusual from the standpoint of the radioactivity. Well, this one has the 2 rings instead of just the 1 ring. We'll find out about this one in a moment. Here we have a number of these 2-ring type halos, the next slide. And here we find that we can associate this 2-ring halo with another isotope of the element polonium. Either it's 164 microseconds for the isotope itself, or in this case, there could be what we call a beta precursor with a half-life of around 27 minutes. Then we have some 3-ring halos. We have the 1 ring, the single disc, the 2 ring, and now the 3 rings, and this is in the fluorite, of course. Here another 3-ring halo in the fluorite, and another set of 3-ring halos, and this is now in a biotite or a mica. And we can associate this halo with the decay of polonium-218, and the half-life there is 3 minutes. Well, as I was doing this research over a period of time, and specifically, at least in the earlier stages, focusing on these uranium halos, I kept seeing these polonium halos, and I began to wonder how they formed. Well, the idea that was in the literature at that time, the reports, the scientific reports, was that these polonium halos had formed as a result of radioactivity that came from uranium. In other words, the polonium supposedly was simply somehow a decay product of the uranium series. And I accepted that idea for a considerable period of time. But as I kept on doing my research and my experiments, it became more and more evident that it was more and more difficult to associate a secondary origin. In other words, the idea was that radioactivity from a source of uranium had somehow separated from uranium and had traveled across the rocks, through the rocks, and had isolated itself in the tiny centers. But the problem, of course, was, number one, I didn't see any trace of the radioactivity going from one place to the other. I didn't see any of the uranium nearby that was supposed to be there. And then as I began to do the experiments, there are a whole number of different experimental techniques that could be used to show that there was no uranium nearby. And I began to puzzle more and more over how these particular types of halos had formed. Well, in continuing to do this and looking at these halos, I began to think more about the way in which I had been taught the history of the Earth, the origin of the Earth. The Earth, remember, coming from a long cosmic development. The Big Bang, 17 billion years ago, then the stars. But wait a minute, we can't have the Earth coming directly from the Big Bang because in the Big Bang itself, supposedly only hydrogen and helium are formed. So we can't get the Earth and the matter of the Earth today just from the Big Bang itself. We have to go through something else. And the something else is supposedly that stars, first-generation stars, formed with hydrogen and helium. They burned and burned and burned. In the process of burning, nucleosynthesis took place. That is, heavier and heavier elements were accumulated, and then at last the star exploded. And the star exploded. Of course, the matter from the exploding star began to expand and expand and expand. And of course, in the telescope today, we can still see the results of some of the supernovae that occurred almost 1,000 years ago, recorded, by the way, by the Chinese. Well, in any event, the Earth then has to be the product, in the conventional evolutionary viewpoint, has to be the product of a long series of stellar explosions. First-generation stars being formed, these stars burning, the stars exploding, and then you've got to go and reaccumulate the matter from these exploding stars and bring it together again somehow to form what initially in science today is known as the proto-sun. And the proto-sun supposedly had swirls around it, and those swirls eventually supposedly developed into the planets, one of which, of course, is supposedly our Earth. You see, once you get to the Earth, and we'll go on to the next slide now. Once you get to the Earth, then you have to have the Earth beginning to cool. And the kinds of rocks that begin to cool first are the rocks that I've been telling you about tonight, which contain these halos, these granites. Or in some cases, they are crystalline rocks associated with the granites, or the crystalline rocks underneath the granites. There's a whole complex of crystalline rocks in the lower parts of the Earth supporting the continents. And it's these crystalline rocks that supposedly began to form first as the Earth began to cool. So this rock here is one of those rocks that cooled supposedly over a long period of time as the Earth was evolving. Well, that's exactly what I had been taught, and that's exactly what I believed as I was contemplating the origin of these polonium halos. Well, if we go on now just a little bit further, here I've tried to outline the evolutionary model. The Big Bang, the stars form, supernova. Actually, you've got to have many, many supernovae, and you've got to reaccumulate the end result of all that, the heavier elements, and then the solar nebula must form, the proto-Earth must develop, and the Earth begins to cool, and the Precambrian granites, the rocks that I've been telling you about, begin to form as a result of that. And specifically, if we look at our next slide, we can see that the Earth forms, and then there's a long period of 4.5 billion years for it to cool down to where we are today. But, you see, if indeed the Earth was cooling down over a long period of time, I began to think, if these polonium halos were not derived from uranium, and they were formed from radioactivity that existed for just a short period of time, then we've got some explaining to do. I had some explaining to do. There's something that doesn't fit. The radioactivity that produced the polonium halos would have disappeared long before the rocks of the Earth cooled down. And there's an analogy, or a very simple experiment that we want to do at this time to try to illustrate what we're talking about here. We have the halos, these polonium halos, and as a result of that, we have an enigma. The polonium halos are formed by radioactivity that exists for just a short period of time, and then it disappears. But in the process of disappearing, some way, somehow, it's left a record in the rocks. Now, we want to illustrate that tonight by the following experiment, very simple experiment. We're going to take some water, and we can turn the 35 millimeter projector off now and turn the other one on. And the radioactivity, as we've said, has a fleeting existence. Now, we're going to put something into the water at this time and make an analogy with respect to what would happen if something were liquid. In other words, if the rocks were still liquid, if the molten material was there instead of being a solid rock, and the radioactivity was in a molten material, it's not going to retain a registration. You won't produce any coloration, so to speak. Here we have an Alka-Seltzer in the water. The bubbles are coming out very rapidly. Now, if you could freeze that water instantly, you would see the bubbles retained within the water itself. This photograph that has just been given to me freezes the process of the bubbles in time. Now, in order for, as I look at the picture here, we have frozen the bubble process in time. Now, we can turn all the lights back on at the present time. If we all come and look at the water now, we know that the bubbles are gone. The radioactivity, unless encountered or surrounded by the mineral itself in a solid form, would have done just what the Alka-Seltzer bubbles did. They would have disappeared within a very brief period of time. In other words, the rock had to be solid within a time frame consistent with the half-life of the radioactivity, within 3 minutes. Well, when this thought came to me some 20 or more years ago, I was stunned, because it occurred to me that indeed something had been left in the rocks deliberately as evidence for creation. There's a text in the Bible which I mentioned in my book. In fact, this text came to my mind one day as I was sitting in the microscope and I was looking at some of these halos, wondering how in the world I could reconcile the short half-life and the long cooling period. And the thought came to me indeed that it had to be an instantaneous formation, crystallization, creation in order for this to happen. That was way back in 1965, and the verse in the Bible that came to me was in the book of Psalms, Psalm 33, verses 6 and 9. And despite the fact that I'm at the University of Tennessee, I'm going to quote the verse. It says, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast." I was stunned. I didn't go out and shout it to the housetops. I didn't know whether it was true or not. It was a thought, but I didn't know whether it was true. I didn't know what the scientific aspects were going to be, but I decided to try to pursue the topic until the very end. So over the next few years, I was still there in my home doing experiments, setting up a laboratory in the bathroom to do experiments in the middle of the night after the children had gone to bed. And fortunately, my financial situation began to improve somewhat, and I was finally taken on by a small college up in Maryland. And in the process of doing this, began more extensive investigation into these phenomena that we're talking about, trying to determine whether there was any other way scientifically that one could explain the polonium halos. I didn't want to go out and tell we were Christians. I didn't want to try to publish it in a religious magazine. I felt the only honest thing to do was to present this material to the scientific community, publish it in the open scientific literature in such a way so that if I was doing something wrong, or by this time I had become a Christian, if I was letting my biases come into my thinking, and these really weren't created rocks at all, and I just was dreaming about something being evidence for creation, certainly the people who were like myself, evolutionists, would certainly be able to spot what was wrong. Well, it was fortunate for me at this time that some other things I was doing in my research came to the attention of some individuals here in Oak Ridge. And I was very fortunate to be able to ask to come down and become a guest scientist for a year. And I was exceedingly fortunate for that year to stretch to 2 years and 3 years and 4 years and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8. And all the time I was there, I was carrying on research on what I'm talking about tonight, but I was also doing something else, which is what they asked me to do, or asked me to come down for. I was a guest there. I wasn't being paid by the laboratory. I had very, very cordial relations with everyone there, as far as I know, and still, everyone there is still my friend. I don't know whether it's the other way around these days or not. But in any event, I stayed there for 12 and a half years, and during that 12 and a half year period of time, published a number of scientific reports relating to what I'm telling you about tonight. And that is information that would indicate, indeed, that these polonium halos are there, separate from uranium. They are primordial. The radioactivity that formed them simply was brought into existence. And that means that the rocks themselves are not rocks which evolved over a long period of time, but are rocks which were created. Created rocks, in my book, I identify, or I call, the Genesis rocks of our planet. If you're going to be a creationist, if you're going to believe in the Bible, record of creation at all, one of the first things, in my opinion, you've got to face is the fact that somewhere in the earth today you've got to find something that was created. The whole earth can't be today something that's redone so badly that you can't find something that's original. And so I say these rocks that I'm holding here tonight in front of you are part of the original created rocks of the earth. Well, in any event, all the documentation, all the reports, all the obstacles that I had in the process of publishing information for creation is documented here in the book. But in December of 1981, in October 27, 1981, I was in my office and I received a long-distance telephone call from the Deputy Attorney General from the state of Arkansas. He was asking me to come and testify at the Arkansas creation trial. Earlier that year, the state of Arkansas had passed a law requiring the balanced teaching of science, of origins, in the public schools. Creation science would be taught along with evolution. Well, as Americans, we have the privilege of differing on this viewpoint. And there are people who feel that this shouldn't be done. In fact, the American Civil Liberties Union, in fact, there are many Christians and other people of other persuasions who feel very, very strongly it should not be done. Well, I didn't know whether to. In fact, I did not volunteer to get into the fray at all. In fact, when the names of the scientists were sent to the Deputy Attorney General back earlier, September or whatever, my name was not on the list at all. But here in October, I was being called. In fact, a friend had called me earlier that morning, and one thing had led to another. And I'd received that call, and the Deputy Attorney General was asking whether I would consider coming to testify at the Arkansas creation trial. Well, a lot was at stake for me, because if there's one thing in this life I love to do, it's research. I've been doing research since 1962, thinking about the topic of origins and evolution and halos and so forth for some 20 some odd years almost. It was a night and day situation, and the idea that I might somehow put myself in a situation where publicity would come about that would be negative and would take me out of that golden, wonderful opportunity I had was something I didn't really want to think about. But nevertheless, there were some things that made me decide that I should go. And that's the reason I'm here tonight. While I was at the laboratory, while I was publishing, from time to time, individuals, scientists who are evolutionists, would read, of course, about the work that I had done, and they would see the results. And they would say, well, we don't know how to explain what you found. We don't know how to explain the polonium halos and the granites and so forth. But there must be an explanation of some sort. And so, therefore, we don't know what the explanation is tonight or today as they were writing in and commenting on my work. But sometimes someone would provide an explanation. Well, this happened in 1979. I had given a paper down at Louisiana State University, a symposium on time, and I was an invited speaker. I had spoken on the topic as I'm speaking here tonight, presenting the scientific evidence for creation. And geochronologists had written in the paper that my article was published in, or I should say a summary of the talk of my presentation at the Louisiana State Conference on Time was published in Geotimes in 1978, also published in the Transactions of the AGU in January of 1979. A geochronologist responded, and he said, if what I'm saying is true, this calls into question the entire science, modern science, of geochronology. In other words, if there are truly primordial polonium halos and granites, there's only one way that happened, and that is instantaneous crystallization of the granites, or the biotite, or the rocks, the basement crystalline rocks of our Earth. He realized that, and he said, if that's true, it calls into question the entire science, modern science of geochronology. Well, of course, he went on to say, he didn't think it was true, that there must be another explanation. Well, I thought about his comments, and they were very cordial. I thought, this is going to go on forever. There's got to be a way to settle this matter scientifically. And it occurred to me that the evolutionary view of the origin of this rock was that it cooled down over a long period of time on the basis of what we call the uniformitarian principle. Now, the uniformitarian principle is simply the idea or the assumption that the physical laws that we now observe in the universe have been sufficient to govern everything down to the present time. In other words, nothing has ever happened except as they have happened in accord with physical laws that we now understand. Well, now, the implication of that is that this granite may have formed a couple of billion years ago, or this biotite crystal may have formed a billion or so years ago, but when it did form, according to evolution, it had to form according to the very same laws that we have today. So I proposed a test. I said, all right, take this piece of granite. It's a falsification test. I say this rock is created. I say the piece of biotite was created. But I go further than that and say, I don't think that you're going to be able to synthesize or duplicate a piece of granite today in the laboratory. In fact, I said, I will consider my work falsified if you can take a rock like this granite, melt it, heat it up, and let it cool. If you can come back with something like this granite, I'll say that I'm wrong. I'm no longer going to say anything about this being a created rock. And furthermore, if these polonium halos could then be synthesized or produced within that piece of synthesized granite, I would withdraw the claim that I found evidence for creation. Well, that was in 1979. And I didn't know whether anyone was going to synthesize a piece of granite the next week or the next month. 1979 came and went. 1980, another geologist wrote a letter to the Transactions of the AGU. He criticized my work, and I wasn't at that time even aware that he was going to write the article. It took me a whole year to get a response published, and the details of that are again in the book. But still, nothing from the scientific community relating to the falsification test. In other words, I'd put everything on the line. If evolution is really true, if the fundamental premise of the evolutionary theory is the uniformitarian principle, the glue that holds it together is the uniformitarian principle. If indeed there is something in the earth today that came as a result of creation, the uniformitarian principle is wrong. That means everything stretching from the Big Bang down to the time that we are here today. Everything stretching from the Big Bang down to the time that we're here tonight cannot be governed or is not governed by the uniformitarian principle. That means every interpretation of radioactive dating, which means the fossil record included in that, every fossil that is dated in conjunction with rocks, which depends upon a constant decay rate, and every one of them does, can no longer be relied upon as scientific evidence for evolution. In other words, the whole scenario disintegrates if you don't have that one uniformitarian assumption. And I put it all on the line. I said, go ahead and duplicate the synthesis of a piece of granite or a piece of biotite. If you can do that, then you will have justified, you will have verified that indeed the uniformitarian principle, the fundamental principle of evolution, is valid. 1979 came and went. 1980 came and went. 1981. Here I was, October 27, 1981, and they were asking me to go to the Arkansas creation trial to testify about the evidences I'd found. Well, I'd been watching the news and listening to the reports of what was happening, and as I said, I was very much inclined just to leave the whole matter alone. But there were people who were evolutionists who knew of my work, and they kept saying there was no evidence for creation. And they well knew what I had published in the open literature. And very few people, relatively speaking, in the public ever knew about my reports until the present time, or as you are tonight, hearing about it. In other words, it was something that was confined almost exclusively to the scientific literature, but these scientists kept saying there was no evidence for creation science. Well, as you remember, years and years earlier, I started the search for the answer because I wanted to know the truth. And I thought about it. And it occurred to me that at the Arkansas creation trial, the world's best evolutionists were going to be on deck. My work would be scrutinized more closely than it had ever been scrutinized before, even though it had gone through the scientific literature and through referee reports. It was going to be re-scrutinized, and I wanted to go to find out, indeed, if there was truth in what I was saying. I thought it was important for me to know, and it's important for other people to know, whether indeed there is valid scientific evidence for creation. So I decided to go, and I went. Well, it was an interesting trial. In fact, my wife and I both were there. And the details of the trial are in the book. The American Civil Liberties Union was there when I took a deposition down in Atlanta. My deposition lasted about 7 hours. It was very interesting. I detailed everything I'm telling you tonight, except in much greater detail about the evidences for creation. This deposition, of course, was used, to examine me at the trial, or cross-examine me at the trial after I gave my testimony. But at the trial, the American Civil Liberties Union brought in the very best in radioactive dating, in subjects concerning the origin of life, and the details of their testimony are all in the book. And I might add that at the Arkansas creation trial, one of the things that I thought had been done, or I thought I believed in many, many years ago as an evolutionist, was that life originated spontaneously. That was, part and parcel of what supposedly was true or was going to be true. I realized it hadn't happened, but I had come to believe that it was about to happen. And of course, you have to have the spontaneous generation of life in order for evolution to proceed. Well, it's very interesting. At the Arkansas creation trial, the gentleman, the scientist who was there giving the evolutionary position for the origin of life, was cross-examined very, very carefully on that point. And indeed, if you're inclined to read it, you can see that after initially being quite positive about the possibilities, under cross-examination, he began to draw back. In fact, you'll see at one point when one of the lawyers for the state was becoming very, very close and penetrating very, very close to uncovering, so to speak, the truth, and the truth being that scientists today do not have and have not ever been successful in the artificial production of life from inert matter. And yet, in the scientific literature today, and yet throughout America and throughout the world, there are numerous scientists who are today receiving very large sums of government money to work on the artificial synthesis of life in the laboratory. At the Arkansas trial, I made the following statement, that indeed, if life were ever successfully synthesized from inert matter, I would consider this, to be a prime example of the fulfillment of an evolutionary prediction, and I would again become an evolutionist. I said it that night, I said it at the trial, and I'll say it again tonight. I do not believe that life will ever be synthesized artificially. It's a lost cause. The only way that will be contradicted, of course, is for someone to do it. At the trial also, my work came under review. The ACLU witness for geology testified for a several billion year age of the Earth and indicated that the decay rate or the transformation rate had always been constant. He was then cross-examined at length about the way in which he viewed that assumption and finally admitted that it was indeed an assumption. And then my work came into focus through cross-examination, and in the context of that, he was asked about the falsification test. And there's a great deal of his testimony, in fact all of his testimony as it relates to the falsification test is here in the book. He indicated that as far as he was concerned, the falsification test was meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. Well, I was a little bit surprised. I had proposed something that evolutionists could use to verify that the fundamental premise of their theory was correct. And yet when it came under focus, or I should say under fire, the testimony was that the test was meaningless. Well, I couldn't quite understand how that could be. If indeed it's something that will enable us in the here and now to decide whether these rocks are really created rocks and whether they're rocks like this all over the earth, the basement rocks are really rocks that were created instead of evolved, and literally hundreds of millions of dollars over the years have been spent by the U.S. government in grants for evolutionary type research based on the uniformitarian principle, based on an evolutionary view of Earth's history, based on an evolutionary view of the origin of life. In fact, that's the reason why some of the space probes have been sent to some of the planets, is to look for the pre-life precursors. And of course, as you well know, they have all failed. In any event, the falsification test at the trial was simply said to be meaningless, and the halos, the polonium halos, the ones that we talked about tonight, which are on the front cover, one of which is on the front cover of my book, was said to be a tiny mystery which scientists would someday solve. Well, of course, when I finally got around to writing the book, I couldn't think of any better title than Creation's Tiny Mystery. Well, my testimony, which occurred during the second week of the trial, I presented in great detail 4 hours worth of testimony, the scientific reports, the scientific evidence, and it was all over, except for the reverberations. The reverberations came, first of all, in the decision. The judge's decision there completely ignored, almost completely ignored the evidence for creation which I had presented in the court. In fact, if you ever get the book, you'll see that the cross-examination related almost entirely to things that were not germane to the falsification test or to the scientific evidence. It was brought out that I indeed believe the Bible, for example. In other words, at that particular time, the questions related to one of the questions in the cross-examination related specifically as to whether indeed I believe the Bible. Whereas I had spent 4 hours talking about the scientific evidence, when the American Civil Liberties Union began to cross-examine me, it was to a large extent not about the scientific evidence, not about the falsification test, not about whether indeed the polonium halos had another alternative explanation within conventional science, but relating to peripheral issues, of course, to divert attention away from the main theme of the evidence for creation. The judge ruled in favor of the ACLU. The law was struck down. A few weeks later, after the trial, of course, I was back here. I was back away from the trial itself in my home, and I picked up a scientific magazine and began to read the account of the trial, January 1st issue, January 8th issue, and I saw some things which, first of all, I saw were not an accurate representation of my work at all. In fact, in my opinion, it misrepresented what I had said, and most of all, it left out the most important part, that indeed science, creation science is science because I have proposed a falsification test. If I'm simply up here tonight saying I found a piece of rock and it's a piece of created rock, then that doesn't mean anything. If I don't propose a test, a way in which we can decide one between the other, it's not science. Well, I explained this all in great detail there at the court, and the science reporter who was there at the trial made no mention of the falsification test. In fact, as I've indicated to you, I felt that some of the things he had said were quite inaccurate. And as a result of that, a situation which I had enjoyed in great cordiality over a 12-and-a-half-year period of time began to change, and I noticed a variation in people's attitudes and their comments, but it's something that didn't surprise me. The spring then of 1982, I was still working and doing research in this area, the laboratory, and I was still doing research relating to things that I felt were of other significance than just creation per se. There was a report that I was working on relative to nuclear wastes, and in fact I was the author, co-author at least, the lead author of a report that was published in April of 1982 concerning the long-term storage of nuclear wastes. Now, normally, this is what laboratories exist for, people to do research and people to publish their findings. In this particular instance, the topic of the paper that I had published was interesting for more than one reason. Nuclear waste, at that time, had just come to the attention of the U.S. Senate. Another bill or amendment was going to be introduced at the Senate. Some senators found out about the report that had just been published. And this report that was published on April 16, 1982, came to the attention of the U.S. Senate, and in fact was brought to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And here in my book, I relate what is now in, what has been in the congressional record since April 30, 1982. Senator Cochran, Thad Cochran of Mississippi, got up on the Senate floor, and I'll let you read what he says, but the comments were complimentary, and the report itself was reprinted in the congressional record of April 30, 1982. As a result of that, some other things happened. Senator Jim Sasser, in fact, his aide wrote me a letter telling me how they appreciated the input that I had through this report to the debate there on nuclear waste in the Senate in April 1982. A few weeks after, pardon me, it was about a week after this point, he wrote me a letter. And he asked me if there was anything that he could do for me, not knowing what was happening. And by this time, I'd been told that my position at the laboratory was going to be terminated. So I wrote him a letter. I said, sure, there's something you can do. I've been doing research here for a long time. I want to keep on doing research. I want you to intervene. But anyway, nothing happened. And June 30, 1982, I was no longer with the laboratory. So I continued my work at home like I had begun 20 years earlier. And the work progresses very, very slowly. And then that fall, since funds were low again and I was running out of everything and had very few friends, I looked around for a teaching position. In fact, I looked for a teaching position in the Knoxville area. And there was a university in the Knoxville area, if you can believe it, that hired me to teach for the fall semester of 1982 in the math department. Well, in December 1982, Governor Lamar Alexander, as you may or may not remember, said we've got a budget crisis and crunch, and so all the temporary teachers who had been hired at the beginning of the academic year 1982 are going to have to be axed, and I was one of them. So January 1983, I had nothing again, supposedly. But then an individual who barely knew me came forward and said, well, you've got an interesting story if you don't have anything else. Then he said, I think it needs to be put down. He said, I'll give you some money to begin writing a book. I said, great. So I began to write the book. His money gave out, and somebody else came along and said, we want to help you finish the book. And I said, wonderful. My wife was especially overjoyed with these prospects. In any event, 1984 came and I was working on the book. And the National Academy of Sciences, as you well know, this question of teaching creation science in the public schools has been on the burner because, you see, in 1982, after the Arkansas law was shot down, Louisiana came forth and they said, we want creation science taught in the public schools. And the ACLU came into the picture again, and as you may or may not know, it's been through the courts. The Louisiana law now went through the courts. The judge said, first of all, the law is not going to be enforced, can't be enforced, or is unconstitutional, or words to that effect. And it went through the state courts, and then it went to the federal district, went to Court of Appeals. But finally, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case, and just last December 10, up in Washington, the Supreme Court heard arguments on the constitutionality of the teaching of creation science via the Louisiana law. And that law, or I should say the court is presently writing its opinion tomorrow, next week, next month. Sometime between now and July, the court is going to render an opinion as to whether the Louisiana creation science law is constitutional or whether it will go back to the court to be tried there in the state of Louisiana. But, getting ahead of my story, going back to 1984, the National Academy of Sciences, whom, as you probably well know, is composed of the most eminent scientists in America, published a booklet, Science and Creationism, a View from the National Academy of Sciences. And in this booklet, they come across very, very strongly to the effect that there is no science in creation science. Absolutely no science in creation science. In fact, they make some comments about, very specifically, the Genesis record of creation. And they don't leave any doubt that they're talking about creation science in the context of the Bible and the 6 days of creation and so forth. Well, as I was writing my book, I decided I wanted to respond because they said there was no evidence for creation science, and every time evidence for creation had been examined, it had always been found to be invalid. So I commented on that as I was writing my book. But last August, I was invited to go up to Pittsburgh for the International Conference on Creationism and invited to give a few talks on the work that we're talking about here with you tonight. And before I went, I decided, well, wouldn't it be great if indeed this issue could really be settled? The National Academy of Sciences says there is no evidence for creation science. And here I've been publishing 15 or 20 years this evidence, and no one is responding or has not refuted it. And so I decided to send the president of the National Academy of Sciences a letter. I wrote him another letter a month later. No response. And now we come to Monday evening, April 13, 1987. And I've written Dr. Press another letter. March 24, 1987. Dear Dr. Press, the February 1987 issue of Physics Today, which I will mention, is the National News Journal of the American Institute of Physics, and is more than a news journal, it carries scientific articles as well. The February 1987 issue of Physics Today, page 86, mentions the National Academy of Sciences as one organization which is opposed to the Louisiana creation science law, now being decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. Doubtless you knew this already because the booklet written by you and others, Science and Creationism, a View from the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy Press, 1984, is quoted in the Physics Today report as follows. It is therefore our unequivocal conclusion that creationism, with its account of the origin of life by supernatural means, is not science. It subordinates evidence to statements based on authority and revelation. Its documentation is almost entirely limited to the special publications of its advocates. And its central hypothesis is not subject to change in light of new data or demonstration of error. Moreover, when the evidence for creationism has been subjected to the test of the scientific method, it has been found invalid. That was a quotation in February 1987 issue of Physics Today. Now continuing the letter. More than anyone else, you should know why the above quotation is meaningful to me. Remember last August, Dr. Press. On August 4, 1986, I sent an overnight letter to you requesting a response to the evidences for creation, which I was to present at the International Conference on Creationism. In my letter, I quoted the above statement and challenged you to show just where my published evidence for creation had been invalidated. On that occasion, I invited you to bring as many evolutionists as you could persuade to come with you to accomplish this task. No response was received either then or about a month later when I again wrote to you. All this is recounted in detail in my recent book, Creation's Tiny Mystery, a copy of which is enclosed. Despite the non-response of the Academy to the challenge of creation last August, the Physics Today report shows the Academy is remaining adamant in its position that evidence for creation has been invalidated. I am therefore offering you, and or whomever you may choose to send in your stead, another opportunity for refuting the evidence for creation published in my scientific reports and summarized in my book. The details of this opportunity are outlined in the accompanying press release, which describes my forthcoming speaking engagement at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville on the evening of April 13, 1987, under the sponsorship of the Society for Creation Science. Certainly, it would seem that you would have no problem in obtaining the help needed. The Physics Today report mentions 72 Nobel laureates who opposed the Louisiana creation science law, including the very well-known Dr. Murray Gell-Mann of Caltech, who, by the way, is a Nobel laureate himself. If that avenue fails, I suggest you contact the most outspoken evolutionist in the country, namely Drs. Carl Sagan and Stephen Gould. In fact, the Physics Today article quotes Dr. Gould, a Harvard University paleontologist, as saying that creation science is an oxymoron, quoting, a self-contradictory and meaningless phrase, a whitewash for a specific, particular, minority religious view in America. Biblical literalism, end of quote. In view of his stated interest in demolishing creation science, it would seem only fair that Dr. Gould be given the opportunity to speak first in representing the Academy on the night of my presentation at the University of Tennessee. I hope you can persuade him to come with you. If the evidence for creation remains unrefuted after the Academy's response on April 13, then Americans need to know on what grounds, if any, will the Academy still object to creation science being taught as a model of origins in public schools and universities. Cordially, Robert B. Gentry. That was March 24, 1987. And copies of the letter were sent, of course, to Stephen Gould, to Carl Sagan, and to Murray Gell-Mann. Well, April 13th is here. And we need to look at the response. Well, before we get into the response from the National Academy, and I discuss that, I have on my program tonight given the opportunity for anyone, students or general audience, who would want to make a comment specifically about 3 items. We can't discuss, as you well know, everything relating to creation and evolution tonight. The whole gist of what we've been saying tonight is that there is indeed evidence for creation. I'm holding before you something I'm saying was a rock that was created. On the other hand, according to the evolutionary theory, this rock was not created, it evolved. And the central focus of tonight's presentation is that there is a test, an experimental test in the here and now. If this granite, or a piece of granite like this, could be melted, reformed, solidified, and come back to a piece of granite like it is right now, I would be wrong. The falsification test would favor then the theory of evolution. And is there anyone in the audience, students or general audience, who wishes to comment on that? We've got to focus very specifically on the falsification test, or on the topic of the polonium halos, something very specific about that. Then you need to have written the question on the back of the little questionnaire, and these need to be passed to the outermost aisle immediately. Ushers will collect these at the present time. And while those questions are being brought to the front, I will mention and read another letter, give you a background. The information relating to our program tonight has been sent, as I said, to a considerable number of fairly responsible evolutionists. One of those is Dr. Carl Feser, who is the editor of the Creation Evolution newsletter. Now, the Creation Evolution newsletter is a newsletter published by evolutionists pertaining to information concerning the evolution-creation controversy. They have published from time to time information concerning the work that I have been doing. And I sent Dr. Feser information about my presentation tonight, inviting him to come, of course, and as many as he might want to bring with him. While they're in the process of looking at the questions tonight, I'm going to go ahead and read this letter from Dr. Feser. Dr. Robert Gentry, etc. Dear Dr. Gentry, thank you for the copy of the March 8, 1987 letter to Dr. Frank Press, President of the National Academy of Sciences, and for the notice of your upcoming April 13 talk at the University of Tennessee. And then he mentions a gentleman up in Canada, and I won't mention his name because he isn't here tonight. He says, this gentleman tells me, he's an evolutionist, tells me that he has sent you a great deal of information on the geology of Ontario, which clearly shows the rocks in which you found halos are younger than the surrounding rocks. That's number one. As you know, then switching subjects, he says, as you know, Dr. Brent Dalrymple and others have offered alternative explanations for the phenomena that you describe. These alternative explanations have the advantage they do not, as yours do, throw much existing, well-established science overboard. In view of all this, I find it one of creation's tiny mysteries why your letter to Dr. Press and the announcement of your talk convey no hint of the above facts. Isn't it necessary for scholars to take into account serious challenges to their visions? Consider all the space that Darwin devoted to origin in dealing with the criticisms of his theory. Evidence that can be interpreted as equally consistent with two opposing views is not evidence relevant to choosing between those views. Until you succeed in overcoming all the serious objections to your interpretation of data, you cannot justifiably claim that you have any evidence against accepted interpretations of Earth's history. So your challenge to Dr. Press and the National Academy of Sciences seems inappropriate. I hope that, in your talk at UT, you will do justice to the criticisms that have been leveled against your interpretation of your data, including those based on the geology of the rock specimens used in your work. And that I fully intend to do. Are we at all ready yet for one of the questioners? The question is from Todd Harvey. If he would like to come up while I read the question, or if not, you can stay seated. Why is it necessary that for halos to form the rocks, why is it necessary that for the halos to form the rocks must solidify very quickly? I think what he's saying is, why is it necessary for the rocks to solidify very quickly? Are there no halos in liquids? That's correct. There are no halos in liquids. Remember the example we showed of putting the Alka-Seltzer in the water? As soon as the bubbles disappear, there's no record of them. In order for you to retain a record of the bubbles in the water, you would have to freeze it instantly into a solid. So yes, it's true. There are no halos in liquids. I'll finish the series of questions, then I'll bring out another example. Jane O'Connor, UT, if it took millions of years for the granites to cool, according to evolutionists, how could this long cooling period be duplicated in an experiment? Well, you see, that's the point. That I'm saying it didn't take millions of years for it to cool, and a particular piece of granite did not supposedly take millions of years to cool. You see, the Earth supposedly was cooling down over hundreds of millions or billions of years of time. And so when you see mountains of granite called batholiths, certainly it didn't take hundreds of millions of years for a small piece of that to cool. So what I'm saying is that only, as we well know, if something is going to cool, it's going to cool bit by bit or inch by inch or foot by foot. So it's not that the entire formation or the entire rock formation supposedly took hundreds of millions, but that rocks were cooling down repeatedly, supposedly over a period of billions of years. But nevertheless, for an entire batholith, something 10 kilometers long by 3 kilometers wide by 2 or 3 kilometers deep, would have taken the hundreds of thousands or millions of years to cool by itself. And so it's not the entire rock itself taking millions of years. It is the rock itself taking millions of years, but on an inch-by-inch basis, of course, the rock is cooling at a definitive rate. For example, and we'll talk about this in just a few minutes, in the context of volcanic eruptions, specifically Kilauea out in Hawaii, there was a lake of lava that began to cool back in 1959. And it had cooled year by year and inch by inch. In fact, several inches per month at one particular time, of the order of 4 inches per month. The depth was cooling. And so solid rock was forming on the top of the Kilauea lava lake at the rate of about 4 inches per month. Well, unless these last eruptions have disturbed things, and they may very well have, a year or so ago it was predicted that by this year or next year, that entire lake would have crystallized. In other words, finally turned into rock. So, yes, the mountains of granite are there, and yes, they all in all took supposedly millions of years or hundreds of millions of years to cool, but cooling nevertheless at a rate which is very well defined, supposedly. All right, Jim Watson, would you define both terms, creation science and science? Well, creation science does not affect the here and now. I go into the laboratory, I publish my scientific reports using the same science that everyone else uses. Creation science today and science today have much in common in that both recognize, as I do, that we're living by known physical laws in the here and now. Where things are different is how we look at the past. The uniformitarian viewpoint is that things have remained under the guidance or the direction of the uniformitarian principle from now to the infinite past. In the creation science model, which I have proposed, and it's in my book, I'm simply saying there were particular times, for example, at creation, there were particular times at the time of the flood, when there were unusual events taking place that cannot be explained on the basis of laws as presently understood. I'm saying the granite cannot form on the basis of laws that are presently understood. So when you're talking about creation science or the possibility of teaching creation science, nothing in physics, in experimental physics, is going to change. Nothing in experimental chemistry is going to change. Nothing in experimental biology changes at all. It is only the basic premise and the interpretive framework of the past that we're talking about in terms of a change. And it says also, why do the three proofs offered on the front of this flyer make creation science science? Well, if you've listened very carefully tonight, I have never used the word proof. I've never used the word proof. I do not claim to have proof of creation. What I do think and what I do claim to have is evidence for creation, number one, and I also have a falsification test by which we should be able to determine whether the evolutionary scenario or the creation science model is based on correct principles. Don Raby, I was requested by Richard Wakefield to seek your response. Do you think, and by the way, Richard Wakefield was the gentleman who was mentioned in this letter, do you think sedimentary rocks were created on the first day? Well, it's very clearly stated in my book. The rocks such as are in the Grand Canyon, I very clearly relate to the period of the Genesis flood. These are rocks that have fossils in them. But I also state very clearly in my book that there were, undoubtedly, in my opinion, sedimentary rocks formed on day one of creation week. These are the non-fossiliferous sedimentary rocks. And are halos found only in Precambrian rock? Well, remember, I use the word Precambrian just to give a broad general overview to help people identify the kinds of rocks that we're talking about. No, in the geological connotation of the word Precambrian, no, they are found in other rocks as well, much later in time, presumably. In fact, I was out in California just in December. I had a long discussion with several geologists. There's a batholith, a granite batholith out there, and they were wondering, what are you going to do about this Cretaceous granite? Well, I talked to them at great length and listened to their arguments as to why they felt it was Cretaceous, meaning the time, of course, of fossils. And it turned out the reason they thought it was Cretaceous is that they felt that the sediments had actually were there and that the granite itself had intruded into the sediments. So therefore they were saying that the granite was later than the sedimentary rocks. Well, as I probed the issue and asked them in detail why they felt the granite had intruded the area, it turned out that indeed the basis of their response was it was a uniformitarian geological type assumption. And I discussed with them at great length, I don't have time to go into it tonight, reasons why, yes, those rocks that are presumably called Cretaceous granites were still a part of the original created rocks, and that indeed that what had happened is instead of the granite coming in as a magma and cooling, it had actually been pushed up from below. Are there other questions? Peter Hansen, graduate student. Assume at an early point in the history of the Earth it was still a molten mass. 2, at this point all radioactive nuclides which are at the beginning of decay chains such as uranium-238 were present. During the period the material containing this nuclide was solidifying, no halos could form. Once the material solidified, some of the original nuclide will still be present. Uranium-234 is available today. Why couldn't this be responsible for the halo formation? Well, I'll have to, if I understand what is being said here correctly, the question that is being asked is part of something we dealt with earlier, and that is, you see, we have a decay chain, and the question is being asked here. It says, during the period containing this nuclide was solidifying, no halos could form. Once the material solidified, some of the original nuclide would still be present. Why couldn't this be responsible for halo formation? Well, it is. Uranium-238 in the rock today has formed uranium halos. Now, the difference in the conventional evolutionary view and the creation model view is the following. The conventional evolutionary view is that uranium halos formed during this long period of cooling as the rocks cooled around the uranium centers, and so therefore the uranium halos today are the result of a long period of production. The view of the creation model, which I have proposed, is that there were accelerated periods of radioactive decay. And so when the rock did form, did crystallize, was created, that the uranium-238, the uranium-234, the thorium-230, and so forth, decayed and indeed produced the uranium halos which we see in the rocks. In other words, uranium halos do appear in the rocks. So in answer to the question, why couldn't uranium halos appear in the rocks? It is true that uranium halos do appear there. And then he says, very interesting presentation. Thank you. Dan Berube, student, junior political science. Why does the presence of polonium halos, which are unexplained by contemporary evolutionary theory, necessarily contradict and disprove the evidence supporting the current theory such as the presence of uranium halos, which do indicate an age of several billion years. Well, why does the presence of polonium halos dispute the conventional view? Again, remember that the conventional view is that this rock is a part of a giant granite formation, and these granite formations extend far into the depths of the earth. So overall, we've got a rock formation that is cooling, from top to bottom or from bottom to top, whichever the case may have supposedly been. We've got something that is taking, over the period of total cooling, a vast period of time. So if polonium is there, the top to the bottom, that is, we find the polonium halos in the granites today from the top to the bottom, then we have to explain how the polonium could remain there if indeed a long period of cooling took place. That's why we illustrated the Alka-Seltzer and the water. The bubbles are there. If indeed something, is the size of this auditorium and it's filled with water, we start to cool it. How long is it going to take to cool? Well, it's going to take a long period of time. That's the same way it is with the rocks. So the polonium halos in the rocks, though, can't wait around. The polonium is going to disappear very quickly. So unless you isolate, unless you condense, solidify, crystallize, create very rapidly, of course, the radioactivity is gone, and there would be no radioactive halo in the rock itself. I'm going to give you another example of that in just a minute using this Polaroid film. A question from the same student, another question. Why does the inability of the scientific community to produce granite rock or spontaneously generate life necessarily disprove the theory of evolution any more than the inability of a physicist to spontaneously generate matter necessarily disprove the laws of physics? It's a good question. Well, first of all, you must understand that I don't know of any physicists who are out here who are claiming anything about the latter part of this question. I'll read it again. Why does the inability of the scientific community to produce granite rock or spontaneously generate life necessarily disprove the theory of evolution any more than the inability of a physicist to spontaneously generate matter necessarily disprove the laws of physics? Well, see, in physics, the basic law is matter can't be created or destroyed. So there's nothing to disprove there. Matter can't be created or destroyed, unless you want to go back to the initial part of the Big Bang. So there's nothing to disprove. But now, with respect to the first part of the question, why does the inability of the scientific community to produce granite rock or spontaneously generate life disprove the theory of evolution? You see, they claim, evolution claims that it had to be. Life you here tonight are here supposedly because of the chance occurrence of spontaneous generation of life sometime in the primeval past in some primeval ocean. It's a claim that is made part and parcel, a fundamental part of evolution. This granite that I'm holding here, this piece of biotite that we've shown and talked about tonight, it didn't come out of nowhere, supposedly, as far as evolution is concerned. It is an integral part of the Earth. It came as a result of the slow cooling of magma with the uniformitarian principle. The physical laws that govern the crystallization of this rock, you see, are inevitably the same that exist here tonight. So, if you want to prove what you're saying is true, if you want to test as to whether that theory is really based on a valid scientific principle, all you've got to do is take it into the laboratory in the here and now, melt the granite, let it cool, let it solidify, let it crystallize, and you should be able to, on the basis of the evolutionary theory and the acceptance of its uniformitarian principle, you should be able to reproduce that piece of granite. Because you see, supposedly, 4 billion years ago, or 4.5 billion years ago, or 3 billion years ago, the laws were identical to what they are today. And may I suggest to you that something, yes, why don't you come up to the microphone?
My name is Larry Taylor. I'm professor of geology at UT. Who said you cannot form a granite in the laboratory? It's been proven for 25 years by hundreds of publications, and just because you're ignorant of the publications doesn't mean that they can't be done. I can do it in my laboratory. People all over the world can.
You know, I'm just so happy you came forward tonight. I'm absolutely gratified because I'll give you the piece of granite. How long is it going to take you to do it?
Under controlled cooling rates, you can form it in about a week.
Can we all come back in a week and see it? Just like this?
On that approximate grain size, not that size, obviously, you have to be much smaller.
Oh, wait a minute. What was this about the grain size now?
That approximate grain size is controlled as a function of the cooling rate, the kinetics of the situation, the crystallization and growth. And you can form that coarseness of granite minerals. You can form those mineral compositions with a cooling rate of about 1/2 degree per hour crystallizing.
I'm going to show you a piece of biotite, a piece of granite which contains the polonium halos. I want you to look at it. How long do you think it would take you to do this one?
That, the grain size, and I don't know what the exact mineral compositions are there, but I estimate the same approximate cooling rate. Anything slower than 1/2 degree per hour over the crystallization range of approximately 200 degrees over which these minerals crystallize will be sufficient to do this.
And we'll, in a week...
And people at UCLA, at Caltech, at Chicago, at MIT, at Harvard, at wherever you want to go, can do this. So I don't see that the big problem. And
well,
Frank Press is from MIT, and that's where, I mean, he would be speaking to that. But I think
more
properly that the reason why you're not getting a rebuttal to this is that people just don't want to rebuttal it. It doesn't, perhaps, you know, it's so well established in literature.
Now, is this the first time that you've heard of this test?
Yes, it is.
I see. So you think that in 1 week you can get this piece of granite back in your laboratory?
I can give you, you know, many publications.
No, I'm not talking about publications. I'm saying you have claimed tonight that you can do it. Is that true?
I don't have my laboratory set up right for that, doing that particular thing. I'm working on basalts, but yes, you can do that.
I think
I'll tell you of a laboratory where I could go and do it, and that would be at Johnson Space Center. They do that down there now.
Now, you've changed the topic just a little bit, and I think the audience needs to be aware that you've gone from a granite to a basalt, and they need to understand the difference. And the reason they need to understand the difference is in my book. At the Arkansas Creation Trial, the ACLU geologist, Dr. Brent Dalrymple, took the witness stand. And in the process of testifying about the falsification test, he testified at length about granite and the fact that there was no problem, supposedly, in imitating the granite, and he brought out the Kilauea lava lake. If you read his testimony very carefully, you find two things. First of all, he admits that you cannot. He does not know of anyone, and he was a person who was there who had studied my results over a considerable period of time before he testified. He knew of no one who had successfully synthesized a hand-sized piece of granite in the laboratory. In fact, he admitted, as I've just read, that it was a meaningful test. But now, in order to change the subject just a little bit, and to present a plausibility argument that it was possible. On the witness stand, he brought up the Kilauea lava lake material, which is a basalt. And he said it resembled a granite, and he used that as an indication that, yes, sometime if you had a sufficiently good apparatus, it would be possible to synthesize a granite. But what he didn't say, and what you didn't say just then, was that there's an awful lot of difference between the grain size of the basalt you're talking about and the granite crystal, which I have right here.
I beg to differ tremendously. That there can be grain size within a basalt flow, within the Hawaiian flows, that is of the same grain size as you have there. That can fool can cool rather form rather rapidly. But regardless of, I'm not talking about basalt. I don't know what your
You mentioned basalt.
I said what I've been working on recently is basalts.
Well, I'll have to comment a little bit further on what you just said.
Well, okay, but what I'm saying is that you can make the grain size of the minerals, you can make the mineral compositions without any problem in the laboratory when you're geared up to do this particular type of thing. It takes controlled oxygen fuel gas, it takes controlled cooling rates in closed containers. You could make something hand size, but we don't make them that large. We have problems with containers. We make them smaller. So we're making them on the order of just a few, 5 millimeters, 6 millimeters across. We're not making a hand size, but the fact is we can duplicate everything, and it's been done for many, many years.
I want to go back to the statement, and then I'll pick up with what you just said. On the Kilauea lava lake, because of what Brent Dalrymple said at the Arkansas Creation Trial, I got samples of the Kilauea lava samples. In fact, they're at home, and I was going to bring them with me tonight. I contest your view, and I have the samples to prove it, that...
I didn't refer to Kilauea. I noticed I said Hawaii. There are many, many flows on Hawaii. You're talking about a very recent, very quickly cool, when you have lava come out and cool more slowly. If it remains in a lava lake and it cools as a crust in there, then it cools much faster. Much slower. And it's continually heated up and it's near a glass state most of the time. So it's very fine grain size.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this question, and following now on the comments that you just made in the
I'm sorry, but I feel that I'll be willing to show you the literature. I'll be willing to talk to you about demonstrations, whatever you want. But I'm not about to come up and sit here and have you change things around about basalts and granites. It's well established in the literature. I can give you that.
I'm happy that this has occurred tonight because it's not the first time that I've heard such a claim. In fact, the letter I just got through reading to you a few minutes ago, and I'll bring his name out now. A geologist up in Canada wrote me a letter. In fact, he's written me several letters. And in these letters, he's pointed out supposedly some things that relate to things that I've been publishing on and so forth. And in the context of this, one of the letters he wrote to me, this is now back in February, he said, a granite sample has indeed been synthesized in a laboratory. Now, from what the gentleman just said, of course, you've got to have high pressures, you've got to have high temperatures, and you've got to have slow cooling. Oh, pardon me, you didn't say high pressures. I should say that the evolutionary view of the formation of granite is such that granite supposedly form at great depths under high pressures. So I'll add this. This is a part of the conventional view. He goes on to say, there is a first-year geology course offered here over the television in the form of a 22-hour series called Understanding the Earth. In the program on igneous rocks, they showed a film that was taken back in the early 60s where a granite sample was crushed to a fine powder, poured into a small copper pot, water added, placed in an apparatus, and subjected to high temperatures. The result was a crystallized specimen about the size of your thumb. He said he had this on the tape. In other words, a granite sample has been synthesized in the laboratory. Well, I was really interested. Since I had issued this test, it was subjected to severe scrutiny at the Arkansas trial in 1981. And I will stop just for a moment to say that in 1985, the magazine Science published a report indicating there again was no science in creation science, and I attempted at that particular time to have a rebuttal published, and it was unsuccessful because the magazine indicated that they would not handle anything relating to creation science. But this last summer, as I've indicated to you, again, I issued the challenge. It's been in the EOS. But anyway, I was really interested. Here's someone who's saying that, you know, it's all on TV. So I got a copy of this TV film, Understanding the Earth, and the particular series relating to the synthesis of a granite. And sure enough, when the material came back to me, I actually got the outline for the course. I noticed, though, that in looking at the TV video and looking at the outline of the course, it didn't really say that a granite per se had been synthesized. It said, you know, this is suggestive of how granites supposedly synthesized. Anyway, what was shown on the tape was a powdered granite, and the powdered granite was crushed and put into a furnace, put into, I should say, a gold or a platinum envelope, and it was taken up to 700 or 800 degrees centigrade, and then it was sufficient water and so forth, it was allowed to cool over a several-month period of time. Well, I wanted to actually find the samples that were in that experiment. It wasn't good enough for me just to say, well, you know, it looks like a granite. I didn't know. Maybe it was supposedly a granite. So I called the gentleman who had done the series now in the mid-1970s. And I asked him to begin to look very particularly at that segment. And I said, I want to know, first of all, did you do the experiment? He said, no, we didn't do the experiment. We took it from an old Encyclopedia Britannica film. And so I said, well, can you tell me more about it? He said, I'll go back and look. And he went back and looked, but he couldn't find any more additional information about it. He only had one name, and through that one name, I began to call around the country, various geologists. And I finally was led to someone else, and they led me to someone else, and they led me to someone else. And I finally found the gentleman who had actually done the experiment of supposed granite synthesis. And indeed, he admitted that this is a part of, of an ongoing research program that they were carrying on at that particular time. Well, I said, I'm very much interested in getting information on the samples that you were trying to synthesize at that particular time, the granite ones especially. And he said, well, that was some 20 or more years ago. And so I continued to check. I got back with him, and he has since retired. He said that he thought he perhaps had a piece from one of the experiments, but he was way out west and he wasn't coming back east until this last week, April 9, in fact. And so I called all over the place trying to get other samples of people who had done these kinds of experiments and supposedly was going to show me this information on granite synthesis. Well, I called him Friday afternoon, just last week. He was back at his home, and I said, I'm still looking for this sample that you had indicated was possibly still in existence. And indeed, he had returned home, and he had been looking for it for 4 days and was unable to find it. Well, I encouraged him to keep on looking and told him I would get back in touch with him. I guess he felt, in fact, he told me he thought, it had been left at some university someplace and he didn't have it. Saturday night, though, I received a telephone call. He had found this specimen that was a part of this granite synthesis experiment of 20 years ago. It was in another state, and all the stores, of course, are closed as far as delivery is concerned, Federal Express. But I paid to have it shipped Delta Dash from his city to mine. If you turn on the 35 millimeter projector again, you'll see a picture of it. There it is. There's a sample that was a part of a granite synthesis experiment over 20 years ago. 700 or 800 degrees centigrade, melted, cooled down now, and if I understood what you said a few minutes ago, you could do it in a week. Well, what we're talking about is something here, and that glass slide right below the penny is a granite sample that was ground up, crushed, melted, and cooled, not over a period of a week, which you said you were able to do and come up with a granite. That was cooled down over a period of 2 months. And it bears a remarkable resemblance to another piece of rock which is adjacent to it. If you go back to the previous slide, I'll talk about the other rock which is adjacent to it. Okay. Claim has been made tonight that granite can be synthesized, like the ones I have up here. But as I was in the last stages of writing my book, and I realized that such events might take place, such as what has happened tonight, I'm very, very happy that it has happened, a thought occurred to me. The laboratory of nature has provided us with an answer. In fact, granite is melted in the earth. In fact, granite comes up through pipes and extrudes on the surface of the earth from time to time. And when it does, sometimes it becomes a glass, which is obsidian. If it cools lower, such as the rock you're seeing right here, technically, I think geologists say it's only a rhyolite if it's on the surface, but there are other people who are geophysicists who say it's a rhyolite even if it's under the surface and cools from a granitic melt. In other words, what I'm saying is what you're seeing on the screen right now is the rock that resulted from the cooling of a granite melt in the earth. And it cooled slowly. And the reason I know it cooled very slowly is because the writing on the rock, you can't see the 1 very easily, is 1,683.3 feet down below the surface of the earth. Now, when that cooled, the rock, the melt itself, the granite melt, did not recrystallize as the original granite. It recrystallized as a fine-grained rhyolite, meaning that the crystals of the quartz and the feldspar are very, very small, whereas the crystals in the granite crystal, which I have up here, are macroscopic, millimeters in size in some cases, and in other cases, such as the rock I'm showing, the material I'm showing right here, inches. In some places, there's a muscovite crystal 9.5 by 7 feet, 3 feet thick. In another place, an enormous crystal, 14 feet, 33 feet long, weight not less than 90 tons. We can turn the lights back on now. And so in response to the comment that it's easy to do granite synthesis, I point to the natural laboratory, the laboratory of nature, in which granite has been melted and allowed to cool an innumerable number of times. And the material does not result in a reformation of a granite, but what geologists call a rhyolite. The only way that you could possibly falsify the comment that I have just made, or to do anything about the falsification test, is not to refer to a report. The reports have been read. The laboratory of nature says it comes back to a rhyolite, not to a granite. I want to make a suggestion then. If indeed the day ever comes when you are successful in doing what you claim to be able to do tonight, my telephone number will be given to you. And you can call me, immediately call WTVK Channel 10, make it a citywide public event, statewide, whatever you would like to do, and publicly put your evidence where your expertise has been tonight. And I'll be very, very happy to be there again. Yes. In other words, I'm saying It can't be done. And until you produce it, the laboratory of nature says that the experiment is going to fail. In fact, the experimental synthesis experiment that has already been done has been shown to be nothing except something extremely similar to the rhyolite, which is what the laboratory of nature says it has to be anyway. Yes?
Even if our geology professor did melt and create some granite, like what you said.
Come up to the microphone.
Suppose that your professor here did create some granite, just like what you have in nature, and it took a week and a half, whatever. I thought the point is, would it have the polonium in it? Would it have the polonium halos? Isn't that the point?
Well, of course it wouldn't have the polonium halos. I was trying to get everyone the benefit of the doubt. I was saying they can, if they could really synthesize a piece of granite, I was going to make it easy for them. Of course it wouldn't have any polonium halos in it. But you see, I've broken the problem down so it's so simple. I mean, people keep saying that the polonium halos are only the result of natural radioactivity. And so I said, if that's true, I'll even let you take a piece of granite today. If you really think that the polonium halos are only a natural phenomenon, take a piece of the biotite or a piece of the phlogopite, something similar to this. If you heat it up, you'll destroy all the halos. Then take that piece of sample into the laboratory and produce some more polonium halos in it. And I'll say even that is a falsification of what I'm saying about the halos being created. You're absolutely right. A piece of granite formed in that way, even if it were done, would not have the polonium halos. But I'm breaking the problem down to a point where I'm saying these are the created rocks. And I'm saying, you know, if you could do something like that, synthesize it, then go put in a halo in it even after it was synthesized, then I would say you doubly falsify what I'm saying with respect to creation. But I'm not going to back down tonight and say, you know, what if this and so. What I'm saying is the laboratory of nature has shown it's not going to happen. I've investigated the granite synthesis experiment that has taken place. A geologist wrote to me and said, and I will quote, in fact, he sent the letter to Dr. Press just the other day. He's writing to Dr. Press, and he's again repeating the claim that a piece of granite has been synthesized, and it was done on that TV Ontario film. And that's exactly what it's taken me about 2 months to run down a 20-year-old sample. If you can imagine, an experiment that was done 20 or more years ago. The scientist indicated he thought, of course, it meant something to me for tonight's presentation. And indeed it did.
Thank you.
Very good.
It seems obvious then that if he grabbed a piece of radioactive polonium from Oak Ridge and had it right next to his furnace and threw it in, quickly mixed it, that 22 minutes later it would be gone, or I propose.
The half-life is only 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
You see, it's not only just the polonium itself that is coming and disappearing so rapidly, it is putting that amount of radioactivity in a tiny speck. When I was there, I worked with various radionuclides, various proportions. People who work with radioactivity will tell you that polonium is one of the most active, mobile radioactive elements known. To what I'm saying even today, with all the technology we have, I'm saying that there is almost an impossible problem of accumulating naturally that number of radioactive atoms of polonium within a 1 micron speck of any kind. You see, because 1 micron, 10 to the 9th atoms of polonium will occupy about 1 cubic micron. So when the polonium halos formed here, they had pure, just about pure polonium in the center. And pure polonium-218, by the way. So I'm only barely skimming the surface of the technical problems that are involved in trying to explain polonium halos on a conventional uniformitarian basis. But you can't imagine how happy I am tonight that someone has come forward and said that it is possible to do that, because now we can be watching in the days ahead. I'll have my telephone on an answering service, and WTVK and Channel 10 and all the rest of us here at the University of Tennessee will be anxiously waiting for this to occur. Yes?
Well, I'd like to see if I've got this straight now. You take a piece of granite that's already been formed, you heat it up, you destroy the halos, correct? Okay, now, I've got 3 minutes to form large grains and have polonium halos trapped in it. Is that correct?
Well,
or approximately?
no. The conventional view is that the granite had to form slowly. And so therefore, as the professor was saying a few minutes ago, he was saying it would take him about a week to do it. But you see, what I'm saying is that he's not going to do it in a week. He's not going to do it in a month or a year. He's not going to ever do it. I'm saying that the way this rock was created is impossible to duplicate. I'm saying that the implications of what we find in this rock are such to show that it was created very rapidly, it was created in such a way that it can't be reproduced. And not only just the granite itself, I'm saying that you could take, I offer the same falsification test for this piece of biotite. Reproduce a piece of biotite, melt it, whatever you want to do, dissolve it, and grow another crystal of biotite like this. And again, I'd say that my view of creation, this evidence for creation, this being a primordial rock, I'll take that as a falsification. So it's just not the granite itself. I've given people a leeway. I'm dealing with just a pure crystal of a mineral. So there's a little difference there. They would not agree that on their basis that the rock ever had to cool very rapidly. In fact, they would be saying that the larger the crystal, the longer it would take to form. And this is why I took pains to read from this paper in the American Mineralogist that there are some crystals in nature today which weigh like this, or very similar to this, a phlogopite, which weigh as much as 40 tons. That is a single mineral formed, of a specific chemical composition, and in the general way of looking at it, it is a mineral that supposedly formed over, the bigger the crystal, the longer it took to form. So something that, if this took a week or supposedly like this to cool down, something that was 40 tons, I'll let somebody else estimate how many millions of years supposedly that took. But go ahead.
But all those halos would have escaped over 3 minutes then.
Well, after about several minutes, the polonium is gone. So unless you do it, it's true. If I wanted to be very rigorous about it, if I wasn't, well, I'll simply say this. If I wanted to be very rigorous and say reproduce what you have in here now, what's in here now, I'd say take this piece of granite in the laboratory, heat it up, melt it, let it begin to cool, and not only when you need to get something like this when you finish, but it should also have polonium halos in it. That's the real test right there. Well, I wanted to try to make it easy on people.
So that means if I had the knowledge to do this in the facilities, I'd have to do all this in 3 minutes, have the same grains, and have the halos trapped in it.
Well, if you really wanted to reproduce what is a part of the primordial genesis rocks of the planet, yes, you would have to reproduce the granite, and you'd have to reproduce the polonium halos in the granite. That's true. Absolutely.
That I would like to see.
I would too. I see we need the moderators up here because I see there are questioners in the back. Would you want to stand up and let one of you stand up and invite the individuals to come forward?
Well, I'm Bill Bloss in the physics department, and I'd like to compliment you on a fine piece of work in the radiation halos, and also on a rather, in my estimation, creative explanation for the ones that are difficult to explain on the basis of the uranium chain. I'm bothered, however, by a comment in your book on page 49, where you say the last chapter emphasized that when I associate polonium halos in granites with extinct natural radioactivity, scientists understand this to imply only a few minutes elapsed from nucleosynthesis to the formation of the solid Earth. Okay, well, that follows. And you say, as figure 2.4 illustrates, which was up on the board, only nucleosynthesis that could accomplish this feat is nucleogenesis, initiated by the Creator, that of virtually instantaneous creation of the Earth. I would suggest that you consider a parallel. I'm sure you're familiar with the line spectrum of hydrogen, and in 1900 it was not explainable, not understood, although it could be calculated with the Balmer series. Perhaps Balmer or Bohr might have come along and suggested that these were, in fact, Genesis atoms. And it would be very much similar, in a sense, to the argument that you're making, because I cannot explain this on any other basis than the one that I put forward, and because nobody will refute the argument that it must stand. And it doesn't really follow that that's true. It doesn't follow that you're wrong, but it doesn't follow we should all jump up and try to refute what you say, mainly because you haven't broadened the spectrum of your argument to include a preponderance of the evidence.
I appreciate you saying what you did. Let me just ask you, in the context of your comment about the Balmer lines and, of course, the fact that in 1900 they could not all be accounted for. Now, what I'm saying, I think, is substantially different than the analogy example you've just given for the following reason. At the time that we were discussing, bringing out here, which, of course, was the turn of the century, we both know that quantum mechanics had not even come into existence. We know that the Bohr atom was not around at that particular time. As you say, there was some basis for understanding some of the spectral lines, but not all of them. Now, is it not true that we realize, the history of physics tells us, that the physicists of that day realized that they were coming into a period where new ideas, new concepts in physics were going to be generated? As we both know, in the late 1860s, we have Hertz, we have Maxwell with electromagnetism, we have the discovery of radioactivity, we have the X-rays in 1897, Becquerel, and then around the turn of the century, radioactivity being discovered, then alpha radioactivity by Rutherford, alpha, beta, and gamma rays. Now, this was a period of time, I think, where physicists generally recognized that new developments were immediately on the horizon, and they didn't have an understanding fully, for example, of the atom itself. Now, I didn't find, as I read the history of physics, that people were postulating that the Balmer lines were necessarily the result of creation. What they were doing was asking whether or not those lines were going to tell them something about a deeper understanding of the theory than they had at the present time. Now, coming back to 1987, we have come down the road, 80 some odd years, and as you well know, being in the physics department, we've progressed considerably in our understanding of nuclear physics. But you see, what I'm saying doesn't involve any deep, complex nuclear physics. It doesn't involve any deep, complex geology, supposedly, except that I claim it can't be reproduced. In other words, there are no principles here that need yet to be discovered that would enable people to go and do this synthesis or this falsification test. No one is claiming that we have to have new laws. That's the whole point, that the uniformitarian principle says the laws that we know today are sufficient to reform this granite. Whereas in 1900 with the Balmer lines or thereabouts, people were actively searching for not only an explanation for the Balmer lines, but for many other aspects of atomic and nuclear physics. So, I'm not interested in, we can have a difference of opinion, but I'm just telling you the reasons why I would feel differently about your comment.
Well, I think really what I was trying to suggest is that one has to consider the modeling possibilities. If you cannot generate a model, which you have generated a model, okay? At the same time, a model could have been generated in 1900 that said, the Creator is trying to send us a message. These are Genesis atoms. And nobody at that time could have refuted that until they were able to come up with a model which was able to take it into account. Now, you may have the answer. Your creative model may be the answer. But it also equally well, and considering the preponderance of evidence for the vast cosmological considerations and data which have been observed, It would seem that it's not likely, but it could happen. I'm just saying, consider the model. You say the only answer is, and I think that that is terribly presumptuous on your part.
Okay, is it... Let me say I'm happy for the applause when people, feel like that you have someone here representing your viewpoint. I think that's great. That's what we're here for. That's what America is all about. Now you need to let me respond. Your first name was Bill, is that right? Is that correct? I have to put my glasses on. I can't tell whether you're nodding. Was that correct? Bill. Would you mind if I call you Bill? Okay. Bill, just let me, without going into this thing too much further, I do want to say this. In the comment you just made, and the difference that I still see in what you're saying and how you're proposing an analogy here is this. Back in 1900, you see, if people were to ascribe a created explanation to the Balmer lines, it would not be possible for them to say, well, these are Genesis atoms, and isolate these atoms from anything else. Because every hydrogen atom that came into the laboratory and was put into the spectrometer would show those lines. And so they would end up having to say, Genesis atoms everywhere. And so therefore they would be in the position of saying creation, creation in the here and now. Well, see, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that there was something very specific that happened in the past. I'm saying that the Bible talks about a 6-day creation, something being called into existence, and I'm saying they're the crystalline basement rocks of the planet. I'm saying that there are sedimentary rocks on top of those, and these relate to the flood. And I'm saying not that there's anything wrong with the present-day science of physics, chemistry, geology, as far as the mineralogy or petrology is concerned. I'm simply saying it's an interpretive framework in looking at the data. And I'm saying that this interpretive framework can be ascertained or judged on the basis of present-day experimentation. And I know it's difficult in a situation like this where people have reputations at stake, and this is a university, and people have courses in progress, and they're teaching students, about various things, for me to come and to challenge the status quo. I don't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. Nevertheless, in a free America, we have this opportunity to have the dialogue, and this is what we're having tonight. And let me say how much I appreciate your comments. Now, one other thing, you indicated, of course, you thought it was presumptuous. If that's all people are going to say about me as a result of what I'm saying, I'm home free. Bill, that was one of the kinder remarks. Oh, that's right. We got out of the line of questioning when someone came up. If creation is possible, why not prove your case by creation of a like sample? This seems more likely. Well, I'm glad that question. I'm glad to hear applause because I'm glad that question was asked. The fact of the matter is, you see, the whole point of my comments and talk tonight is that creation is something I can't do. Creation is something that belongs in the province of the Creator. The reason I'm saying this can't be duplicated is because I'm saying that natural laws cannot account for the occurrence of a piece of rock like this, or a rock like this, or the piece of the biotite. So I never claim. I say it's impossible to go back and try to form, or quote, create anything like this in the here and now. So this seems to be a misunderstanding of what I was saying. It says, what exactly are the halos composition? Is the color due to what? It's a radiation damage process and interaction of the radiation with the rock itself. Now, I promised you earlier I was going to give you a short analogy. If I can get this back on the camera, I will try to do it. Dare I ask someone to turn the lights out just very briefly and then turn them back on? Wait a minute, let me turn this on. All right? See if I can find the button. Would you turn them out just very briefly? More out. No, these up here I want out. Okay. Thank you. You can turn it back on now. This picture, when developed here in a few minutes, or a few seconds, will hopefully show you. And I want to make an analogy between the flash of light from the camera going to the audience, coming back through the open shutter, and impinging upon the film. The rock can be compared to the film. It registers the light particles. The film registers the light particles. The rock registers the interaction of the radioactive particles. I shouldn't say light particles, the light rays. The film registers the registration of the light rays, interaction of the light rays, whereas the rock registers the interaction of the radioactive particles. The synchronization of the light with the open shutter coming through is the same as the synchronization of the radioactive particles interacting with the rock. It takes both the instantaneous flash of light coming through the open shutter, impinging upon a template, in this case the film, in this case the rock. And so this is the analogy, the way in which you've got to have an almost instantaneous crystallization, creation of the light or the radioactivity in order to retain or to maintain or to produce the photograph, which is the halo in the rock itself. Perhaps this will aid at least a little bit in another simple analogy of why I'm talking about instantaneous creation in terms of the halos. Let's see, Jim Watson, I've already answered. Here we have a question from Tom Green. Could you please explain how the halos could prove or disprove the constant decay rate of radioactive elements such as uranium-238? What I'm simply saying is this. If indeed there is creation, then we have the action of laws which are above and beyond anything that we know of today. We have something being called into existence which didn't exist before. You see, that breaks the chain of events from the present back to the infinite past. If the uniformitarian principle, which is that, if you break the chain of events, if physical laws have not always been the same as at the present time, you break that chain of events, you break that constant decay rate assumption. It goes on to say, are you saying that in order for the uniformitarian principle to hold true concerning the formation of the rocks, that the polonium halos' half-lives were orders of magnitude longer than they are today? No, I'm not. I'm saying that creation itself is one of those special periods where the Creator intervened and the earth itself was brought into existence. There then followed a period of uniformity. And during that period of uniformity, the polonium decayed, the polonium halos formed. There was another long period of uniformity, and as you read the book, if you're interested, you'll find that there I postulate another period of uniformity and have the evidence given there in the book that the other uniformity, at least one other disuniformity, non-uniformity, was the flood. And so there are at least two separate periods of non-uniformity which break this uniformitarian chain. I've already answered that question. I think the rest of these, as far as I can tell, I have answered. And now I would like to turn my attention then to the last part of my talk tonight. Remember I said I'd... pardon, surely there's another one here. Well, if I didn't somehow, it may have gotten overlooked, but I'll be happy if you'll tell me what it was to respond.
Instead of having creation science taught at UT, which is the point of this debate, why not insist that scientists, teachers follow their own rules, the scientific method, when discussing evidence for and against evolution or the young Earth versus old Earth? Shouldn't there be the same result as that from teaching creation science?
Pardon me, would you mind repeating that? I'm afraid I got most of it, but I want to make sure I understand before I respond. And your name again?
Dr. Roland Bagby, Department of Zoology, and also a Christian.
All right.
All right. The question I'm repeating is, I'll read it again. Why not insist that scientists, teachers follow their own rules, that is the scientific method, when discussing evidence for and against evolution, young Earth versus old Earth? Wouldn't there be the same result as that from teaching creation science?
Well, let me say this. The first time you spoke, you prefaced that remark with another statement.
Yeah. Instead of having creation science taught at UT, why not insist, etc.?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to make it very clear tonight that I'm not in the process of insisting that creation science be taught anytime, anywhere, at any place. What I'm here tonight for is the exposition of evidence. My position is very simply that if there is valid scientific evidence for creation, why should it be suppressed? If indeed there is valid scientific evidence, then why should it be suppressed? I'm not in the position of trying to determine for anyone whether they should or should not teach it. My personal quest in this whole issue is a quest for truth. I'm here tonight to present this material. If someone, as has been indicated here tonight, really has something valid to put forth that would contradict or falsify what I've said, this is the greatest thing that can happen. Because the last thing in the world I want to do is to go down a road where I'm believing something that is wrong. Go ahead.
The purpose of this debate, I thought, was to determine whether or not creation science should be taught at UT. That was the question that was at the top of a lot of editorials. And so I assumed at the end of this we would figure out whether creation science should be taught at UT. I'm suggesting an alternative. If we have honest scientists, wouldn't we have the same result as having the creation side also put forth by creation scientists?
Well, there's a two-pronged answer to that. First of all, again, even though the title of the talk tonight, I didn't imply that it was a debate, but I'm very, very happy for the response. I, again, did not want to imply that I was trying to make it appear as if I was enforcing or trying to enforce or trying to prejudice or persuade people to teach creation science. It's simply a matter of coming and asking the question, should it be taught? The answer, I think, lies in whether there is evidence for creation to teach. If there is valid scientific evidence, then, as far as I can tell, the academic freedom that exists in colleges and universities should open the door for it to be done. Now, the other question, the statements you've made, of course, you put me on the spot in the sense that you've essentially said, if people are honest, wouldn't such and such happen? I like to feel that everyone is honest, and I'm not here tonight to imply that anyone is dishonest. I'm here tonight to present information and to obtain rebuttals, to entertain questions and responses, and this is what we've had, but I, in no case, I'll have to bow away and shy away from the point of judging someone and what they're doing. But I appreciate your questions. I do appreciate that. You may surely go right ahead. Come up front.
I'm Robert E. McLaughlin, recently retired professor of geology here at the University of Tennessee, chairman of the committee opposed to curricular oxymora, or COCO. I was drawn to this topic tonight under the title, Should Creation Science be Taught at UT? The papers are full of this topic. TV is here. It's a media event. And yet the speaker has not really addressed this question at all, which attracted many of us in the audience, I'm sure, including myself. Is not the true title of this talk, Should Creation Science be Taught at UT, so that Robert B. Gentry might have a teaching position, which he apparently has had difficulty locating in his career.
Dr. McLaughlin, I think we know someone in common. David McQueen, is that correct? All right. I think David said he was going to write you before I came. Let me say I'm very happy and pleased that you came forward and made the comments that you made. It wouldn't have been a complete night without something like this. People can't hear you back there. I'm sorry, I didn't. I'll tell you, I can't hear what you're saying. If you come back to the microphone, make it so much easier for everyone.
I didn't understand your question about David McQueen. He warned you that I would be in the audience. Was that the
No.
the idea?
No. David indicated to me that he was writing a number of his old professors in the geology department to come to the meeting tonight. He wanted to hear what your response or what your impressions of the talk would be. And I said, I'm just very happy that you've been here tonight. You've been felt free to make them known to the audience.
David McQueen here tonight?
Not to my knowledge.
Well, I'll have to write David and tell him I'm pretty disappointed. I wish there was some way I could give him my $2 back.
Well, on that point, I'm very happy you stated what you did, because I did make the comment, I did choose the title for my presentation tonight specifically because the National Academy of Sciences, in their booklet, which I've talked about at great length in my book, has repeatedly said that they oppose the teaching of creation science in the public schools because there is no evidence for creation science. And so,
one wonders where the expenses for this presentation tonight have come from. The very glittery TV ads, the fine support publication around campus for this talk. Most everyone knows that this particular topic or this advocacy is on the agenda of the PTL Club and the other evangelicals.
well, Dr. McLaughlin, I'm glad you said that too. I'll tell you.
So let's. So maybe I could send this up to Lynchburg, where perhaps it came from, or someplace like that.
Well, Dr. McLaughlin, if you want to stay there, let me respond. First of all,
I'm not here to debate you.
Oh.
And I am disappointed that you did not address the issue, which is the topic of this talk tonight, rather than regurgitate this so-called evidence that you have for creation, but not evidence that creation should be taught as a science. This is.
Oh, wait a minute. All
right.
Well, I'm glad you said that. Well, whenever you give me the chance, I'll make some comment.
But just so you have some more money to support your further research, I'll make that donation to your, whatever it might be.
Well, again, this could only happen in America. How great it is to be in a place where people can say anything and everything they want to say about you. Well, let's see now. Let's go back to the comment about me not really responding to the topic tonight. As I was just saying a few minutes ago, the reason I have done what I've done tonight is really very simple to explain. The National Academy of Sciences, which I've documented in my book several times, in which you undoubtedly have seen their booklet, as we've read tonight in that letter I sent to Dr. Preston, they say over and over again, in fact, that was what was published in the Physics Today article, and I've read it again tonight, they say that essentially they do not want creation science to be taught because there is no evidence for creation. There is no evidence for creation, no scientific evidence whatsoever. And so I thought tonight that with the University of Tennessee faculty, what value would it be for me to come to an esteemed, educated, sophisticated audience and to stand up here and say, well, really what I believe about teaching creation science at University of Tennessee is thus and so. My opinion doesn't really make any difference unless I back it up with something that is scientific. Yes, I am taking a position. I'm saying very clearly tonight that the evidence for creation science does exist, and I'm saying is that it really hasn't been refuted in spite of what was said tonight, and I will maintain that position until the gentleman in the geology department comes forth and actually produces this piece of granite. I'll say it has not been falsified, that it is scientific evidence, and that it does falsify the theory of evolution, and that indeed this does need to be taught. Now, that needs to be made very clear. The question is, I think, in what department? We got two hands. Well, of course, as I point out in my book, I never advocate someone to teach anything that violates their conscience. I think that's the bottom line. That's why I'm doing the work that I'm doing, is because I don't think I want to believe something, it isn't true, and I certainly wouldn't want anyone else to say anything or teach anything that wasn't true, or they didn't believe was true. So, you know, after it's all over tonight, a lot of people aren't going to believe what I've said, irrespective of the evidence, irrespective of the fact that it has falsified. The laboratory of nature shows it hasn't. People are going to leave tonight, and they're going to believe what they believed before they came in. But I still say that with the academic freedom we have here in America, if indeed there were people, and I don't know that there are any people, but I'm saying if there were people who believed the evidence and saw its scientific value, the fact that indeed evolution is based on an erroneous uniformitarian principle, I'm saying why not teach the scientific evidence? That's what I'm saying. And I believe that if indeed there was an individual here, and indeed if it could be allowed by the administration or the students, or, you know, if someone wouldn't be run out of town because of it, I'm saying yes. Why not? If it's true, why not teach it? That's the basic premise I'm operating on tonight. This is why I've gone through great lengths tonight to present not my personal opinion per se, but the scientific evidence which I've been publishing in the open scientific literature. Now, I'd like to also comment on another statement you made, that I'm here tonight in hopes of trying to conjure up or drum up a teaching position. Let me assure you, I don't think there's any chance in 1,000 years that after I've said the things that I've said here at the University of Tennessee, that the administration would even remotely consider the possibility, as you have well said. And I see there are people, you know, who do not want it. It's very clear of that. Well, let me assure you that, and the comment, of course, you made was that something I supposedly need. Well, the fact of the matter is I don't need it. And that bears on the other comment that you made. And for those of you who are in the audience, you might reflect on why would Dr. McLaughlin tonight associate me and this program and the funds for the program, why would he begin to associate me with the PTL Club? Is it possible? Is it possible? Kirk, would you come up, please? Is it possible that after the evidence has been presented and it has not been refuted, and I say it will not be falsified, and I'll say the geology professor tonight who made such a dramatic claim will not be calling me in a week or 2 weeks or a month or a year. He will never call because he'll never be successful. because the granite synthesis experiment has already been done, because the granite synthesis experiment in nature has already been done. It's shown to be rhyolite, not granite. But Kirk is the president of the Society for Creation Science. And rather than my telling you where the money came from, I think I'll let Kirk tell you where the money came from. And before he does that, I want to remind you that when I started out 4 years ago, I invested every penny I had to begin my research. I borrowed money, and over the years that has continued. Now, Kirk, I'd like for you to tell the audience where the money came from for our program tonight.
I'm rather glad he called me to the front. I, too, like you, was somewhat curious in seeing the sound system, which cost $350 tonight. We had another offer for $1,100, but that was somewhat over our budget. Anyway, I had inquired where might these funds be coming from and learned that there were businessmen who had a great enough concern and a great enough interest in this subject to want it to be made known to the nation and to the world. They have remained anonymous, and they have provided the funds for Mr. Gentry to write his book. I think that's a very honest way for him to conduct his business through the private grants of concerned citizens to continue this effort. Thank you for asking.
In other words, I paid for it out of my own money and was hoping, of course, that the sale of the books tonight would cover my expenses. Obviously, that isn't going to happen. Obviously, I'm going to be greatly the loser in terms of my finances in doing what I've done. But as far as I'm concerned, it was all worth it. Thank you, Kurt. But I'd like to say this as well. There was no one connected with that organization that was just mentioned. In fact, I have nothing to do with the organization that was mentioned here tonight. There's someone back there. Would you like to moderate the question or come forward?
The gentleman that just spoke, Dr. McLaughlin, says he was somewhat disappointed. But he's not near as disappointed as most of us are, and that he is here, and instead of refuting the evidence you presented, decides instead to attack the man. That is it seems, over the past several years, has been the method that those who deny creation scientists have taken. If the evidence is there to refute it, we all call for them to present it. And if not, to get behind it, but not attack the man.
Well, what can I say except, of course, I appreciate the comments. However, I don't want anyone to feel that you hurt my feelings. I've gone into this, and over the years, I want to assure you the remarks that have been made tonight are quite kind compared to some of the things that have been said over the years. There are many, many other things that I could say, but it's getting late and I've got to stop. I did receive a response from the National Academy of Sciences, and we want to show that letter right now, and then we're going to close. All right. Dr. Press, this time, was gracious enough to send me a reply, and I appreciate that. As you can see, he says, I am responding to your letter of March 24, 1987. The booklet, Science and Creationism, A View from the National Academy of Sciences, provides in detail an answer to the main point of your letter, the reasons why this institution, meaning the Academy, maintains that creationism should not be taught in the schools. You see, what he's doing is reiterating the main point of the booklet. The main point of the booklet is simply that there is no evidence for creation science, and that's why I geared the presentation tonight on a scientific level. Your work on radio halos is a matter of record in journals and can be debated by scientists. That is the way science works. I cannot agree with your contention that one small piece of data invalidates the vast body of evidence from geology, astronomy, biology, radio dating, the fossil record, genetics, and other fields that, taken together, irrefutably show the age of the Earth is about 4.5 billion years, and that life on the Earth had its beginnings billions of years ago. Now, I want to stop right there and respond. First of all, as I've indicated before, creation science is not going to change anything with respect to the here and now. Physics, laboratory chemistry, laboratory biology, there is no difference. As a scientist today who believes in creation in the past, certainly physical laws today are operating on a constant basis. The question, though, is whether the interpretation of the data is correct. And as individuals sometimes do, Dr. Press has taken the science of the present, which is valid, and has lumped that with the science of the past, or what is presumed to know about the past, when he, of course, talks about geology, and, of course, assuming that he must mean historical geology or the interpretation of geology, and thereby equating the historical interpretive aspect of geology with the so-called, for example, mineral identification and the physical aspects of geology which can be validated in the here and now. In other words, what he's done is to lump some things which are absolutely correct in terms of the here and now, present-day science, and then lump that with the interpretive framework and say that all this shows that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and life had its beginnings billions of years ago. Notice this, and I'll read the last statement, then we'll go back. Notice this. Dr. Press does not even mention the falsification test. Doesn't even mention it. This is what it's all about. People have said creation science is not science because there's no way to falsify. There is a way to falsify. And there's also a way to tell whether the evolutionary principle is valid or not. And as of this night, the evidence is that the evolutionary fundamental premise of the evolutionary theory is wrong, that evolutionary theory is falsified. Here's the last statement. There's a quote from Albert Einstein inscribed on his statue on the ground of the Academy building as follows: "The right to search for truth implies also a duty. One must not conceal any part of what one has recognized to be true." Well, from the very inception of my work, I presented everything that I have found to the scientific community in an attempt to get a response. I have hidden and concealed nothing. You may reflect tonight as you leave whether the same has been true in respect to the way in which the work that I have done has been presented to the scientific community. My whole book is an attempt to reveal everything that is done. And the thing I want to reveal the most tonight, which is yet to be responded to by factual evidence, is the evidence for creation in terms of the falsification test, the Creator creating something which today cannot be reproduced. I would urge you to consider all the evidence. This I have done. This, too, is the way science works. I would suggest tonight, in considering all the evidence, it is the burden of the other side to consider the falsification test and the evidence of the halos, which have yet to achieve an explanation within conventional science. Thank you, and good night.